Welcome back to the What's Your More podcast. I'm your host, Quinton Harris. You're dialed in for episode 235. So, man, this morning we're going to talk about consumers. Are they overextended or are they just done spending? Existing home sales, how they are expected to improve over the year. This is a big one because we talk about it all the time. Signals from the Federal Reserve members and from the Federal Reserve. Are they starting to create a clear picture for us of things to come? And then 5 things I did last week so that I can answer Elon's email not to get fired. And finally, what's up with this flu season? All this and more in the next episode of What's Your One More. All right, welcome back to the show. So let's get on with this. Consumer overextended, or is the consumer stop spending? You know, I take a look at this because for me, this is something we talk about quite frequently on the show. Credit card debt has been alarming to us. And I don't think it's so much in the manner of like it's going to create a recession, but I have said I thought this was the financial market that has cracks in it. It's continuing to show those cracks. It's continuing to show up, and it's not getting any better. I mean, the most recent reading on the New York Fed that comes out with the quarterly economics and the consumer spending shows that shows recently that the data from last quarter, being Q4 of 2024, indicated that credit card debt is now showing 1.21. That's 1.21 trillion with a T in credit card debt, as well as increasing signs of delinquency. They're up to 11% on credit cards and also up to 5% on auto loans, some of those hitting new 10-year highs. And the reason that's interesting is because the bulk of those delinquencies are going to be between the ages of 18 and 39. Now, if you're an avid listener to the show, you know this graph I'm about to pull up will be on our YouTube channel at What's Your One More with the number 1. But if you're new to the show, please tune into our YouTube channel at What's Your One More with the number 1. Click that subscribe button. Get these graphs. You also get any further presentations we put on there. A lot of insightful things if you're listening to this that show up on the screen there at YouTube versus listening to it on Apple or on Spotify. But in this graph, one of the things I want to take a look at on here is this what they call transition into serious delinquencies that are for credit cards by age types. And this is one thing that the New York Fed continues to monitor and they put out. But what you'll see on here is that there is a distinctive difference between 18 and 29-year-olds and 30 and 39-year-olds. Now, the reason I bring that up is those are the two leading, and it's not even close. Those two age groups, so 18 to 39, as we know, are also Gen Zs and millennials. That is the leading of the pack of these delinquencies. Now, let's go back to the presentation we did on our forecast. We talked about the new first-time homebuyers age is 38 years old. So you could make an argument that most of these credit card holders are not homeowners. And the reason I think that's important is because we've consistently talked about on here, plus with some guests like Logan Montashami, that the credit card debt issue is not necessarily with homeowners right now. It's with those that are not homeowners. And I thought that was an interesting thing because homeowners can absorb this, not because they're homeowners, because if they need to refinance, they have equity in which they can refinance and pay off those credit cards. If you're not a homeowner, that's a lot different. So in these retail sales that recently came out, what was interesting is that they're showing signs that the consumer may be saying, hey, I'm good, pump the brakes, or they're tapped out. Basically one of the two, because the new purchases have seen one of the lowest readings in 2 years. Now, we're a consumption economy. Like, we need consumers to consume the product, right? We also need to make the product, but consuming the product drives the economy. And so if those numbers are down, that's not a good sign. That's actually part of a weakening economy. And so it'll be interesting to see coming out of the holidays, was this just a one-off or is this a sign of things to come? And I would say that some argued that, hey, listen, maybe this reading came from some of the wildfires in California where people just aren't spending right now. They're more worried about their homes and where they're going to transition, where they're going to live. But the counter to that could be that if you look at online sales, they were down and off quite a bit as well. They were down 2%, which kind of combats the idea that the California fires, that's not what's causing this. It's actually the consumers all over not spending money right now. And when you take a look at this, I often say, like, is it the consumer tapping out? Is it the limits that they're reaching? Or could it be the fact that credit card debt is now at a higher interest rate than we've seen over the last 2 years have been so high that we've seen prior to these 2 years, probably over a decade. And so could it be the combination? They're not necessarily tapped out. Like, they have limits because, you know, in this report from the New York Fed, you can see there's a lot of limit availability. It's just, they just can't afford it anymore. You know, you're putting money on these credit cards at 21% interest. That payment starts to become pretty extensive versus the traditional, 12 to 15%. So I think it's a combination of both, but I think it's more of, hey, listen, I can't afford to spend anymore. I can't afford to make these other purchases that are, basically luxury items or items that I don't need. Meaning it's non-food, basic necessities, et cetera. So I think that's interesting, and it's also a sign, more of a sign than interesting. And because as the economy starts to weaken, that's one of the concerns of the Federal Reserve. And I think this is just part one of this podcast recipe as to why I think the clearing of the picture from the Federal Reserve to lower rates is coming. Meanwhile, when you see an economy like that, we still have the naysayers out there talking about, I think I just saw a podcast the other day where a guy was saying 2008's back. It's not back. I wish people would quit saying that. Mortgage delinquencies are still at all-time lows. Bankruptcies and foreclosures are still extremely low. Nowhere near the pre-crash levels of 04, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. They're not even close. That same report that I'm indicating reflects that. So it's interesting. The only thing that's up is that the credit card debt is 41% higher than it was prior to COVID. That's the only thing that's currently up right now. So the 41% credit card debt higher than pre-COVID levels. So talking about the crash, right, 2008. Another thing that I'm seeing on here that kind of is not irritating, but also like it's poor journalism. So you have my father-in-law sent me an article from MSNBC, and the headline was existing home sales drop. Something about could this be a turn for the real estate market? So then I pull it up and I look at it, and it's Diana Olick from MSNBC, who traditionally is a negative Nelly on the market, but more importantly, it's not good journalism. I mean, if she was sitting here across the table, I would tell her that, because the manner in which that article was written was fear-mongering and not really 100% accurate. Existing home sales were down, right? They were down. They're traditionally always down in the month of January. If you think about it, if the home buyer is shopping for a home in January, they typically start that process in November and December. Well, what else is taking place during November, December? Holidays. This is not abnormal to see existing home sales down in January. There's just not a lot of people that want to buy a home or even sell a home during the holidays. I mean, can you imagine, hey, I want to list my home. Oh yeah, let me let you in where I got all the Christmas gifts under the tree. Come take a look at it. Like, no one wants to do that stuff. Like that's not an abnormal time to see that. And you typically, traditionally speaking, see a massive rebound in February and March, because once people put all that away and they've got settled back in, like, okay, hey, it's time to buy, or hey, guess what? I'm ready to move now. You start seeing it. March traditionally being the major pop of that. So this isn't to me unexpected. The one thing that was left out of that article, and the one thing that I wanted to point out to my father-in-law, was that, hey, here's what's interesting. The year-over-year sales are still up 2%. So even though January was down, it's still up 2% in that reading from what it was last year. And I thought that was interesting. And then CoreLogic kind of jumped in on the backside of that earlier in the week and said, hey, listen, home prices were actually up 4.5% in 2024. And then obviously right after that, Redfin says, well, hey, we got to give a statistic. They said that they thought the housing market rose 2.5 trillion to 50 trillion, that the value of the housing market rose from 2.5 trillion to 50 trillion in 2024. That's like a $45 trillion jump in equity over the course of 1 year. How can those home prices continue to keep doing that? It also means that if you put that together, it's like a 5% increase of what they're saying on there. Well, ironically, in our forecast, if you go back and look, our appreciation for 2024 was right at 5%. That's literally what we targeted in the U.S. and in the Northeast Florida market. So I'm not saying we were right, but I'm saying that it fell in line. And if you recall, our forecast this year is 6%. So I do think that it's kind of countering that naysayer of that 2008 crash booms coming thing. It just continues to be more and more data that suggests those individuals don't know what they're talking about, that's clickbait, that's fear-mongering, and that's an opinion. It's not factually driven. And so for me, the other thing I take a look at on here was some of the Fed members, right? So we've been talking about how it's frustrating when we get a podium talk from Powell and he sets the tone for the next 6 weeks. And then behind that, we know we're going to get additional reports, but these other Fed members come out and they counter what he's saying. And it was almost felt like they were, hey, look at me, look at what I can say, put the attention light on me. But this has been so far the first time I've seen consistent Fed members come out behind Powell and emphasize what he said, the most recent one being Fed Governor Waller coming out and saying, hey, that CPI reading that came out, as you recall last week, it was not favorable. It actually was kind of ugly. And it didn't shock the market, because if you look over the last decade, it's traditionally speaking 9 out of 10 times that reading in January is typically a hotter reading. So we're not too scared of that. And we do believe that that's going to continue to come down, and that's not going to prevent us. This is the key. He said, it's not going to prevent us from cutting rates going into the rest of the year. I thought that was really important because we really needed to hear that, mainly because we haven't heard that yet. So for me, that was exciting and beneficial. Also, clearing up the picture like we talked about, just continuing to clear up that picture of what's coming. If some of this stuff we're talking about on the podcast interests you and you're like, hey, Q, I want to be a homeowner. I want to buy an investment property. I want strategies on how I can take advantage of the market. I have a solution for you. And that solution is Loan People, to where it's all about the people getting the loan and the people doing the loan. You guys know me by now. I've been doing this podcast for years, but I've been in the mortgage business for 23. And it's very rare you can find a company that has a mantra for loan officers, by loan officers. And what does that mean? That means you have a company that's designed to help provide the best atmosphere for loan officers possibly imagined. And not only that, the most efficient operations for those loan officers to be successful, which provides a better customer service. And that's what you get at Loan People. So much so that they put that in the company name. And at the heart of this is the people. It's in-house processing, it's underwriting, it's closing and funding. And why choose them? They got great rates. They close on time and they have award-winning service. So check them out at loanpeoplejax.com. That's loanpeoplejax.com. Last episode, I talked about Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, talking about, hey, we're going to revalue gold. We're going to mark to market the gold. Thought that was a wonderful idea because if you recall in that episode, I talked about how gold hasn't been revalued since really 1973, the $42 an ounce. Today, it's somewhere between $28.90 and $2,900 an ounce. He came out, and I guess a lot of people, really kind of gave their opinions, asked a lot of questions, and he came out and said, hey, listen, This isn't what I had in mind. So basically he said, and I'm reading here, he stated, revaluing gold to help treasuries is not what I had in mind. And I think the whole concept was people thought that he would revalue that. It would create this additional equity that you could now revalue the U.S. Treasuries or help bring down Treasury costs by not issuing so many of them. He said, that's not what I had in mind. To me, that was kind of a bummer because I really thought this was kind of a forward-thinking idea. I think a lot of people kind of go, oh, air out of the balloon because it was like a novel idea and it seemed pretty impressive. Not to say they won't do it, but it's interesting to me that came out. And then now the new thing is we're going to go to Fort Knox and open up a Fort Knox and make sure the gold's there. Thought that was maybe those two things go together, maybe they don't, but there seems to be a push for that. But the highlight of those Fed minutes that came out and were released is that they're ending their balance sheet runoff. Now, if you recall, we've talked about what that means as part of quantitative tightening, right? The QT as it's called. So the Federal Reserve is getting more and more less restrictive. They're still restrictive, but the quantitative tightening is important because the quantitative tightening says, hey, every month we have mortgage-backed securities that pay off in the form of either loans being paid off, loans being refinanced, or loans maturing, okay? They're paying off, though. And every time they pay off, the profitability from that or the portion of the mortgage-backed security is paid back to the balance sheet. And typically, the Federal Reserve would reinvest that back into more mortgage-backed securities. Well, when they let it run off, it's because they want their balance sheet to go down, meaning they just let that money run off and the balance sheet's deducted by that amount. So the combination of treasuries and the combination of mortgage-backed securities equates to roughly about $40 billion a month. So there's $40 billion a month of runoff that's happening. And so currently speaking, they've been letting that run off and not reinvesting that. By them saying that they're going to middle of the year, which is just a few months away, we're at the end of February right now, that they're going to stop that, indicates that they're going to start re-entering the market and buying back mortgage-backed securities and U.S. Treasuries. Why is that important? Well, that's creating additional demand. Now, if you've been a long-time listener to our show, you know the largest buyer of U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, typically speaking, is the Federal Reserve. That buyer has been gone for over 2 years now. So it's easy to see that when that buyer has been gone from the market, you're depending on other people to help buy that, but you lost the largest buyer. So imagine like running a business and your largest customer leaves the business and they're no longer buying your product. That's probably going to cause, one, a little bit of panic. Two, where am I going to get other buyers from? And three, what am I going to do to my prices? Well, in this particular case, if no one's buying, the price goes up. It's very different than retail sales. In retail sales, if I'm going to buy this cup that I have here and no one's buying this cup, we slash the prices of the cup to where we attract more buyers. In the secondary market for bonds and for mortgage-backed securities, you have to increase the attractiveness by making the yield greater, thus making the product more attractive because now I want to buy it because I'm getting a greater return. So as this largest buyer has left the market, these prices have naturally gone up in combination with everything else from risk to market volatility that we talked about on the show. It's been a challenge. this goes back to what I've been talking about. The Federal Reserve does not have to lower rates. If they just re-enter the market as the number one buyer again on a monthly basis, that is going to drive down the yields and drive down the less, basically the less attractiveness of that, where more people essentially are buying it, but the Treasury is going to have to lower that yield, right? It's naturally going to happen because you got more buyers in the market. And so that's going to bring down the 10-year Treasury. As that brings down the 10-year Treasury, we know mortgage rates will naturally follow that as well. And I think that's really important because we have not seen this buyer in quite some time. And they're saying mid-year. Mid-year is when this is going to happen from their meeting notes. So mid-2025, I mean, that could be anywhere from May to June. Maybe you could argue July, but it's right around the corner any way you look at it. This also adds to my forecast why I said at the end of Q2, early Q3, we could see a 5 handle on the mortgage rate. So if you got the Federal Reserve saying, hey, listen, we're not worried about inflation. That report that came out on the CPI. Now remember, we get PCE here on Friday. This episode's dropping on Wednesday. So 2 days after this episode drops, we get the PCE reading. There's indications that that's going to come in either at or below expectations, and that could be a win as well. It's another windfall going into this meeting. So a combination of that. You've got a combination of the QT kind of going away, the balance sheet runoff going away, and then the combination of the economy, retail sales, ISM data, all the production data, all of these things are coming in, all the economic indicators are coming in that, hey, listen, you might want to start about cutting rates. You might want to start doing it now. And so even though we don't see a favorable market watch saying, hey, listen, I think it's going to happen, I bet by Friday, if that PCE comes in at or below expectations, this switches to almost from about 8% chance to I bet a 50% chance, and it won't take much to do this. Big news is this. By mid-year, we know the biggest buyers of treasuries are coming back to the market, and the biggest buyer of mortgage-backed securities is coming to the market. That is a massive win for the consumer because that will bring those lower interest rates and the affordability that we've been talking about. And so I think very excited about this. And if you talk about affordability, I think there was a comment in there about, going back to what I said at the beginning of the show about 5 things I did last week. If you go to the premise of that is the commentary from Doge and Elon Musk sending out an email saying, hey, listen, just tell us the 5 things as a government position you did last week for your job. That's it. A lot of uproar about that. A lot of people are insulted by that because at the end of that statement, he said, if I don't have something by 11:59, we'll consider your resignation. I don't know how legal that is. I don't know if that's even plausible, but I think what he's trying to do here is he's trying to identify, are some of these emails real? Are we paying for positions that don't exist? He said, this is just the most basic of emails. You could say, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did that. 5 bullet points. It does not have to be well written, just 5 bullet points. They're just wanting to make sure you're a heartbeat and a person doing that job because there is a belief there's people getting paid that have emails, that there's no one sitting there. And so they're trying to clarify that. But in the I guess the byproduct of that is they're saying any money they find or any money that is considered fraud money, they would like, and this is not a guarantee, but they're suggesting that they could issue checks back to the American taxpayers who paid for this and are entitled to have that money back up to the tune of $5,000. I think there's a lot to be said before that's done, but the interesting concept behind that is $5,000 is a lot of money. That could help a lot of people. I mean, with some of the insurance problems that we're having across the nation with homeowners insurance, that could help with that. I don't necessarily think it's going to help with affordability to go buy a home, but I think it can help a lot of people that are potentially struggling, and it can help a lot of people that are kind of getting blindsided by some bills that are coming in, like insurance and homeowners insurance that we've discussed. Will it happen? I don't know. Lots to be said about that, a lot to come of that, but it is interesting. And it also, on the flip side of that coin, if you want to, it also bodes the question of, is that helping inflation? Because if we give $5,000 to people, they're probably going to spend it, and rightfully so in this economy, but are we pumping more money back into the system? Because one of the things to counter inflation is actually taking money out of the system. So some may argue, well, you should use that money to pay down the deficit. It's a nominal amount compared to what we're looking at $38 trillion. I don't think this is going to really put a crack in that, but putting that money back into the American people could be a win from like a Robin Hood complex, if you think about it. But it also could actually end up hurting the form of inflation. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. We will be following that. But more importantly, let's stay tuned for these interest rates because, again, everything's lining up just as we discussed, and you're going to see it happen here. And again, mid-year could be the big hit for all of us here. So we'll stay tuned. We'll watch it. If you like what you're hearing, please share this podcast. Give us 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. And also check us out our YouTube channel at What's Your One More with Number One. That's at What's Your One More with Number One. And until next time, we'll see you at the next episode of What's Your One More.
I got one more shot, I'm gonna make it. One more chance, I'm gonna take it. I meant it when I said it, now it's time for me to do it. I got one life to live, so I put my all into it, yeah.